morning, Ashers! Welcome to another episode of my coverage of Ashes of Creation. So there has been concerns about my voice quality and the recording quality. Do not worry about that, guys. I'll be getting a new microphone pretty soon. I expect it to be available again in the next month. Living in South Africa means it's a little bit harder to get some decent products here, so I'll probably have to import it. In today's video, I'll be covering the archetypes and classes and what we can expect while playing them. Note that a lot of this information will be speculative, as the information is pretty scarce right now, so don't expect too much footage or explanation that is guaranteed at this stage. Right, so let's jump into it, shall we? First of all, the game has several different levels of customization of your character. This is a lot of different factors involved, and the most notable things here are the archetypes that create your class. So first of all, a main archetype decides your primary activated abilities and provides you with the skills you can use to play the actual class. The secondary archetype will allow you to gain access to augments or ability changes at level 25 and later. So in other words, let's say for example you are playing a fighter and you combine that at level 25 with a mage. You are able to create a change in your abilities. An example of this that Stephen has mentioned would be the fighter having an ability called a rush. This is essentially just a gap closing ability where your character rushes towards the target, having a chance to deal CC as well as dealing damage when it reaches that position. But as a secondary mage archetype, you are able to apply an augment to this ability with skill points to allow you to teleport to your target, both shortening the cast time and giving you increased mobility in the process. It's worth noting that the secondary archetype you choose will not provide you with any additional skills, but will instead just change the way the skills work from your primary archetype, providing you with a bit of customization on how your class actually plays. This will require skill points and all kinds of different things to be able to gain access to them. Picking a secondary archetype that is the same as your primary will give you more options or a deeper customization of that specific role. Talking of roles, the primary archetype you choose happens to coincide with the role you end up taking. Yes, that is a little bit flexible in many ways, but the primary role you'll be fulfilling is based on your primary archetype chosen. Your class is decided by the combination of the two archetypes you end up choosing. For example, using the same example I used earlier, the fighter plus the mage makes you a spell sword once you have picked them both. Stephen also mentions that additional augments using skill points can be attained by having higher ranks within a religion or a society that resides on a node. Whether this is like improved healing or something along those lines is a little bit unclear. Once again, that's in the realm of speculation. Before I start jumping into the individual archetypes that we'll end up finding in the game, I would like to just mention one or two small things that might be interesting from a gameplay perspective. First of all, elemental damage. Yes, that will be a thing. There will be an actual divide between physical damage, fire damage, lightning damage, anything along those lines might present a different damage type and require different resistances. These skills and elements will have increased or reduced effects based on the seasons that are taking place in the actual game. Yes, there will be seasons, as awesome as that sounds. So, as an example, if I was to cast an ice ability, the winter might increase the damage that deals, and summer might decrease it. There will also be an additional category of skill types, activated or passive, that will allow players to interact with the world around them, that will not have any kind of combat effect. Stephen used an example of the rogue being able to find hidden doors and traps, making life easier for the party as a whole. And finally, for the miscellaneous small things I wanted to mention, the devs are talking about an ability called, or a group ability called, a monumental effect. What this entails is whenever 8 of the same archetype come together to cast a specific type of ability, as an example, summoners coming together to summon a minion, and they all use it at the same time, a larger, more powerful version of that will be summoned. The devs specifically on the wiki mention a siege minion that can be spawned in this way. The Mage, master of elements and spatial manipulation. Incinerate and electrocute your foes with arcane power or teleport your allies behind enemy lines. If stunning kills are your thing, the Mage is for you. I am pretty sure that this is the most favoured class for Steven. It's the class we have the most information about, and it has the coolest set of different abilities that you could ever think of. From teleports to earth and quakes to fiery balls and death to tentacles even is what we can expect from this class. In terms of spatial manipulation, we can blink, teleport, create after images, and pretty much just do all kinds of weird things. In terms of out-of-combat utility skills, we know about one so far, which is Mage's Detection. This reveals secret passages and hidden terrain, as well as casts a light for everyone to see in the dungeon with. I am not entirely sure how weapons interact with the classes themselves, and if all of them can use all weapons, but the mage seems to be able to use a focus of sorts, which is either the spellbook or what they are calling an orb. This obviously, I assume, is to allow them to create an auto attack or a basic attack that doesn't require mana. I can honestly see why Steven so heavily seems to favour this archetype. It seems really fun to be able to throw magic and all kinds of elements at your enemies, and the extra spatial manipulation just adds an additional layer of interesting to it. There's some mention of Mage Classes, so this obviously means when you combine the different two archetypes together, you can create some cool combinations. I'm just going to name a few of them that I think sound really cool. First of all, Mage plus Rogue gives you the Shadow Caster. I can imagine that thing dealing crazy amounts of damage. The Ranger and the Mage together make the Spell Hunter, which also sounds like a really cool concept. Of course, I have no idea how these two might interact together, which is why I'm going to a bunch of speculation as I go through each class, just to add a little bit of, thought experiment behind it. Never wanting of friends, the Cleric is there to banish the wicked and support the righteous. Despite being the primary healers planned for Ashes of Creation, this class has way more depth than it initially appears. They are considered to be the masters of life and death, both at the same time, and will provide control as well as management of a fight to this party involved. Besides healing, they will also provide other forms of support, like increasing the mana gain within an area for the group. To name a few cool sounding skills, there's a skill called Lifeline, which is a chain heal between allies, or something a bit more unique where it actually bounces between targets and averages out the HP that is currently within that party. This then, if you augment it, provides an additional regeneration effect. The only confirmed weapon we know for the Cleric at the moment is the Staff. I'd expect them to use wands as well as the various foci like spellbooks or orbs as well. When applied as a secondary augment, the Cleric will provide augments that are either life or death. These will provide additional effects to your skills just like normal, except they will mostly be providing self-healing benefits when it is the life choice. And as an example, they use for the death side of things that a Cleric augment to a Summoner will provide you with a different type of summons. So for example, stuff like skeletons or zombies. There have been mentions of an out-of-combat utility ability that might be able to relate to corruption in the PvP sense of things. So if you PvP and you kill someone that is a non-combatant, you gain corruption, and clerics might be able to reduce that. I'm not entirely okay with that idea, as that system should be completely separate from gameplay itself. You specifically want to combat griefers, and you don't want a third variable to, at the end of the day, change how that dynamic is supposed to work. Oh, and I forgot to mention, these guys get to use whips as well as an additional ability. This isn't a weapon that you actually apply, from what I can tell, but it's a really cool lightning whip effect, or rather a light whip effect. I would love to see an increased form of damage that could be called Holy, that does more damage to undead and that sort of thing, more reminiscent of D&D or Pathfinder, of course. You could even make it so that the heal skills can target enemies when you spec for it specifically to deal damage to them instead of healing your allies, or both at the same time. As for classes, I'm not very excited by any of these names, but that might just be because they don't resonate with me. To name a few, there's a Shadow Disciple, which is a cleric and a rogue put together. This is a little bit interesting from a name perspective, because you wouldn't normally associate a primary cleric to be a Shadow Disciple. Maybe this is where a more damage-focused cleric comes from. And then there's of course the Templar, which is a cleric and a fighter as a secondary. So that's pretty cool as well, but what that might entail once again is up for debate. Keep your enemies at arm's length with the ranger and skewer them with arrows and bolts. Be the master of the bow. The ranger is all about using the environment and distance to your advantage. This doesn't mean that the ranger will be incapable of doing melee combat. The way this will work is the character will pull out a bow or crossbow, the two weapons that they will be capable of using, perform the ranged attack, and then swap back to their melee weaponry when those cooldowns or abilities are not available, or at any time that you choose. Weapon swap seems to be unique to the ranger at this point in time, and I'm not entirely sure if other classes like the rogue will get the same ability. When wielding a ranged weapon, there is a minimum range available on your abilities, so it's important that you swap and change the main weapon that you will be using during combat as required to maximize your combat effectiveness. The ranger will also be able to use traps to set up an ambush in some way. As for out of combat utility skills, there is an ability called Track, which will allow you to see whether someone or something has passed your path or a specific area. I'm hoping to see a bit more weapon variety than the simple bow and crossbow, maybe like a flintlock or something that's a one-time use rather than like a normal gun that continuously fired. Maybe like, for example, using your flintlocks dazes your opponent for a short period of time, allowing them to kind of not be able to cast abilities of any kind. Another cool aspect that I would like to see is that if you combine Ranger and Summoner archetypes together, that you can summon pets like dogs or hounds or even plant-like beings that can assist the Ranger in combat. But I honestly don't know if that's going to be the case. In Melee, I expect the Ranger to be a little bit more agile, almost roguelike kind of fighting style, with flanking and all kinds of CC associated with it, as well as evades for obvious reasons. Like regaining the distance to the target so that you can default back to your bow and provide some direct damage in that way. These melee weapons seem to mostly include a sword and shield at this point in time, but I can expect daggers or something similar to take precedence as well. Ranger as a secondary archetype doesn't seem to have a lot of information around it, but we can speculate a little bit. Let's say you are running a fighter. By speccing into the Ranger as a secondary archetype, you are now able to throw or augment your abilities to throw your sword or shield at the enemies. There's also an ability called Marked Arrow, which increases the physical damage that the target takes. So I can imagine that this is kind of rolled into other skills of the other classes, or rather archetypes, when it comes to a secondary spec. My favorite two classes, once again combined archetypes, would definitely be Ranger combined with, again, Ranger to make a Hawkeye, because who doesn't like Hawkeye, even if he's wearing weird spandex. And then the Strider, which is Ranger plus Fighter, which gives me some real Aragorn vibes. Maybe a bit of a more melee-focused fighter, which would be cool. Inspire your allies and leave them in awe with your acrobatic martial arts. The Bard is all about that hybrid playstyle and impressing your allies and foes alike. There unfortunately isn't a lot of footage or even imagery available for the bards, so I'm just going to fill up the background with some random gameplay, mostly of Mage, I'm guessing. Intrepid describes the bard as a type of force multiplier for your party. I think of them as a support class that is an active part of the combat by doing acrobatics attacks, as they have mentioned. Intrepid has mentioned that the bard has a specific attack with a sword that applies a debuff or buff to the enemy, whichever you choose to call it, where if the rest of the party attacks that target, they gain a positive effect from that. In addition to being an active part of combat, they'll also have proximity-based and proc-based healing, but to a lesser degree than the Cleric. They will have a large variety of abilities to choose from, such as wordsmithing, acting, and musical things. How this ties into combat I'm not entirely sure, and whether these are mostly just aura-based, or will there be more physical attack or rather magical attack animations associated with it. There is also a high likelihood that they will be able to play instrument like flutes and bagpipes. I honestly wish there was a little bit more information about the class because it's such an iconic part of Dungeons & Dragons or Pathfinder that it's very hard to translate it into a more active game like this one, which is, supposed to be a hybrid tab target as well as action combat system. And I'm not entirely sure how Bard fits into that. That doesn't mean I'm not excited for the class. If they could make this work and make it super interesting, especially the, advertised flamboyant acrobatics that's involved with it, it could be really fun to play. And also provide a playstyle that isn't really common in any other MMO I've seen. As a secondary archetype, I really don't have any ideas as to what this could entail. Maybe minor versions of the auras, but that would be kind of, linear and boring and not very exciting to think about. Maybe if you guys have better ideas, let me know in the comments. As for classes, there's actually quite a few ideas I came up here with just based on the names of them themselves. The coolest one is probably Tell Sword. For that one time you want to tell the enemy how you're going to kick his ass. There is also Siren, which is a bard primary and tank secondary. This is a little bit weird because if you think about it, a Siren draws in the enemy. So does that mean that the bard will be able to manage aggro when it has tank as a secondary archetype? Who knows how this will pan out, as there's just no precedent for a class of this nature. That I'm aware of course. Maybe you let me know if there is. A frontline fighter to control the engagements and protect your allies. The tank is for you. While I'm not perfectly happy with the naming of the actual tank archetype itself, it's worth noting that the game doesn't actually focus on that as a name for the class you'll be playing. It's primarily going to be named after the class, which is obviously your combined two archetypes, which will decide what your class is named. So for example, having a tank and a bard will be an Argent, or a tank and a tank will be a Guardian. So while the name tank is really disingenuous, it doesn't actually represent the name of the class you'll be playing. The tank is essentially a frontline fighter that will control the battlefield and the opponents that you are facing. Threat will be the primary aggro mechanic that is built around tanking in this game. So if you apply threat, whether it be to the enemy or yourself, not entirely sure which one that is, you gain a priority of attack from the opponents you are facing. I'm assuming this is only going to be in the case of NPCs or enemy mobs that are not players, for obvious reasons. For players, you'd obviously need something along the line of taunt, but it sounds like a really interesting way to control a battlefield by having threat as a primary method of tanking. Threat isn't the only way to control the combat. There's also a javelin, which allows you to pull a specific target. Incidentally, this also increases the amount of threat that you have or gain in some form. Other CZ includes a shield bash and other things to basically tell your opponent that no, you're not allowed to move to another target. You're attacking me or dealing with me first. The Ashes Wiki goes into the 3 different types of builds or tank types that you could consider. These are evasion tanks, control tanks, and shield tanks. This obviously means that evasion tanks will be able to avoid damage completely with maybe a chance base to evade. And then obviously shields, being a weapon type, will give you access to skills or maybe just specific types of abilities that allows you to block damage instead. Right now, there doesn't seem to be any real information around out-of-combat utility skills like the other classes might already have spoken about in this video, so it's a little bit unclear, but I can imagine something cool, like, for example, applying a out-of-combat effect to someone that allows them to take less damage from environmental effects like traps, for example. The tank can also summon walls, which are fully interactable or collision-based objects that can cleave a battlefield or area in two. A monumental effect that the devs mentioned is where 8 tanks come together and try and summon this wall at the same time, and this literally cleaves a massive wall down a area. So this is very impactful inside a node siege or castle siege. I saw an image and a video of this the other day where the wall is actually being summoned. Now, it's actually not a very physical wall, it's more like light particles and effects. Whether that is final is obviously not the case, but it looks really cool, and I love the idea of being able to use something along these lines that's more physical in the world around you and actually has collision, preventing people from having movement around a battlefield. Now, besides everything I've just said, don't think that the tank won't be able to deal damage because it is considered a archetypical tank, but there's actually another type of mechanic called hatred that seems to be applied, and the higher the hatred is, it looks like the damage of your skills are increased. So the tank is a tank, but it actually has a damage component to it, where I'm assuming you're going to play off of threat and hatred to try and find a balance between tanking and damage at the same time. I absolutely love this idea in a PvP setting, because at the end of the day, when you're playing PvP, you don't want to limit yourself to just one role. Yes, healers maybe, but tanks should be a little bit more versatile than just being able to absorb crazy amounts of damage. As a secondary archetype, the tank doesn't have any information around it, just like many of the other classes, but once again we can speculate quite a bit. So for example, I can imagine the tank as a secondary archetype to apply to a fighter allows you to tank a little bit more damage, or even control aggro to a limited degree. So let's say, for example, you use your dash ability on the fighter, and as it lands you gain hatred for damage, or threat if you want to gain tankiness instead, which adds an extra layer of more viable tanks than just a pure old tank itself. As for tank classes, once again, the two archetypes coming together, the Knight Shield sounds amazing. So this is a primary tank and a secondary rogue. I'd assume this is more of an evasion tank that also has a little bit of damage and maybe even a little bit of semi-invisibility. It's worth noting that invisibility won't be 100%, it's just be like a shimmer, so you'll still be able to find your target if you're paying really close attention. Another one that's cool might be the Knight, so that's a tank tank primary and fighter secondary. Four heads are better than one, and the summoner is able to use this to their advantage. Once again, there's very little footage or imagery available for the summoner specifically, so right now I'm pretty much just going to look at using the footage that is from any kind of pre-alpha that we've gotten available from the studio. The summoner is all about versatility, according to the wiki. There's not too much information, but they did mention a lot of different small aspects to how the summoner might end up working. Most notably, they'll be able to summon up to 3 different summons that provide a different role. So for example, a tank summons, a DPS summons, and a healing summons. These summons, thematically speaking, will be very different based on the kind of points and archetypical augments that you'll end up using. So these could be undead, like zombies, skeletons, corpses, whatever the case may be, spirits, or animals, or all kinds of things, depending on the choices you make. My biggest concern when it comes to any kind of pets is that direct control usually means they have to be either really weak or very interactive to be able to make them balanced and fun to play with or against. On the upside, it does seem like they actually want to have them controllable to some degree. Whether this means full control or half AI or anything along those lines is a little bit unclear. But by summoning a minion, you will actually gain an additional skill or 3 on your bar to control these minions. The secondary archetype of Summoner, allowing you to apply augments to other classes, actually sounds super exciting. The most notable thing they mention here is that you'll be able to summon weapons on a temporary basis that you can use in combat that'll apply damage to people in a unique and special way. I'm not entirely sure what these effects could be, but imagine being able to temporarily deal increased damage or larger AoEs or something along those lines with unique spell effects, which is specifically mentioned on the wiki. Something more unique to Ashes seems to be a kind of way to change the appearance of your actual summons other than the actual type. So what I mean by that is that a type, being a spirit or animal or undead, but an actual appearance of those individual categories will also be possible based on in-game drops or kind of collectibles via animal husbandry, which is part of the crafting kind of professions, and then obviously cosmetics that you can purchase in the store. I hope these aren't too heavily in the cosmetics store though. I know that's a little bit of a grey area for me personally, especially having them specific to the summoner being able to purchase them. Races will also play a part in what kind of summons you end up bringing up in terms of cosmetics. I'm not entirely sure if the actual abilities will change. I doubt that'll be the case, but if it is, that'll actually be really interesting from a theory crafting and racial specific ability perspective. Unfortunately, none of the class names really jump out at me for Summoner. But I really quite like the idea of a Brood Warden. I'm not entirely sure why that sounds cool, but a Summoner as a primary and a Tank as a secondary gives you a Brood Warden. The reason I find that interesting is because you'd be brooding and standing still while tanking damage, and your summons would be doing other things, like providing you with DPS. So a very brooding spec that could be. Another example would be a Spellmancer, so that could be a Summoner as a primary and a Mage as a secondary. No idea what that could entail. Zipping through the battlefield to get to the backline, the fighter allows you to move around and deal with any circumstance and get out at a moment's notice. This video will be moving into really uncharted waters at this point. We don't have a lot of information going for the next two following classes, being the fighter and the rogue, of course. This isn't necessarily a no information kind of section, but I'll be speculating an extreme amount during this, so bear with me. The fighter is expected to be a master of physical combat as well as a master of many different weapons. So whether this be, swords, daggers, ranged weaponry, all seems to be rolled into the fighter archetype. The only skill that we know of right now is that the fighter will have a rush ability, which can then be edited based on, obviously, your secondary archetype. But the mobility seems to be a really, really big motif of this class, and it will have a really big burst to get down the healers or the backline of a fight specifically, as Stephen mentioned a few weeks ago. What I would like from this class is a highly versatile playstyle based on the second archetype you end up choosing. So for example, if you end up picking a tank, the fighter becomes a bursty but also pretty tanky type of class. That would actually be called a dreadnought. So the name actually suits up quite a bit there. But I'd assume the class be very generic until the actual secondary archetype is applied. I'd also like to see a lot of weapon swapping and incentive to try and use as much tools to your advantage as possible. Almost like they've got a toolkit at hand. I honestly can't see a lot of people getting excited about this class, primarily because it fills a strange middle ground in the kind of playstyle you would be. So it'd have to be a very versatile class to make people want to enjoy it and actually use different kind of archetypes with it and try and make it work or more interesting in general. As for applying them as a secondary archetype, I can't really begin to imagine what this might entail. I'd assume at least one part of it might be the increased mobility, or even the addition of more weapon types that they're able to use. But other than that, my imagination is completely failing me in this regard. This isn't a very fantasy-esque type of class, so it's very hard to think of something that might fit in the setting itself. If you guys got better ideas, please let me know in the comments below and we can talk about it. I'll even mention it in next videos. Masters of Opportunity, the rogue dishes out frightening amounts of damage by using positioning and solid utility to its advantage. Once again, a archetype with very little information currently available, but we're expecting a lot of DPS, at least single target DPS from this class. The most notable thing that we can expect here is obviously stealth. Now stealth, just to reiterate, is not going to be a complete invisibility, but instead a shimmer or obscuring of the actual player's character when they go into stealth. Whether stealth actually breaks targeting and will require action combat to apply damage to the player is very unknown at this stage, but I can imagine this being a kind of action combat-y kind of forcible mechanic. So in other words, to be able to damage a rogue within stealth, you'd need to attack it directly using a directional skill or a skill that applies damage in an area specifically. This adds an interesting layer of counterplay to stealth that not a lot of MMOs get right. In most cases, MMOs actually frustrates the enemy by allowing the rogue to either detarget completely, which means your tab targeting is completely irrelevant, or by making it complete stealth, both breaking the ability to actually see them as well as target them in any way other than just large AoEs on the ground. I would expect to be very mobile while playing this class and actually utilize flanking attacks to actually increase the damage you're doing. So attacking an enemy from behind might increase your damage by, let's say, 15% across the board. Obviously there is risk involved in this, but it should add an additional layer of risk versus reward, as well as kind of a fun, more interesting playstyle than you would expect from just pure DPSing your target on a fighter, for example. Steven has mentioned quite a few times that the out-of-combat utility that a rogue provides centers around the idea of finding traps or hidden treasures or doors within dungeons. These traps, doors, and treasures will change based on the time of day that you're doing it. So there's going to be incentive to actually run this class when doing a dungeon. And with parties of 8, you actually have quite a few options in terms of actually filling out a party to a nice and balanced degree. As a secondary archetype, I'd expect the rogue to apply a stealth or even flanking ability from the secondary archetype to a main archetype. So for example, let's say you're running a ranger and you want to have access to a little bit of stealth or increased damage by attacking a target from behind, you would gain that from having the rogue as a secondary archetype. This class, where the rogue is the primary and ranger is the secondary, would become a predator, which sounds pretty cool. I think the shadow guardian, which is a primary rogue and a tank secondary, also sounds like a really fun option that you could take, probably to actually enable a kind of evasion tank playstyle, while also having large amounts of DPS on a single target at the same time. I would also like to see the rogue being able to use a large variety of weapon types, be they ranged or swords or daggers, obviously of a physical nature, so not being able to use magical stuff like staves or staves, I'm not entirely sure what the right term is, or wands or foci like spellbooks. In a video where they were previewing the actual rogue or predator, to be more specific, that should be on your screen right now, they're showing a kind of parkour fighting style, or movement rather, where you actually move around the map using the terrain, like climbing over walls, onto ramparts and stuff like that. So Assassin's Creed kind of gameplay, and I'm not sure if this is unique to the rogue itself, but it would be great if that was the case, because it'd have more class identity by doing so. That about wraps up the speculation and information that we currently have available around classes and archetypes themselves. I was hoping to make a little bit of a longer video with more information, but as it stands, there is only a limited amount of information actually out there. So a lot of this video was speculative, which means that as more information becomes available, I'll probably end up making class-specific videos as well. So let's say the alpha releases and the 5, I think it was, available classes during the alpha will be covered individually in a more 10-minute format. So look out for that. It's going to be quite a while before that releases, as we're about 4 months out from the first alpha. I don't have access to that at the moment, but I'll be speaking to the Ashes of Creation team to get me access. Unfortunately, you can no longer purchase it either, so I'm trying to find a way so that I can actually provide you guys with first-hand information on the game itself, and as the development process continues. I'll also be covering way more actual aspects of the game. Most notably, the next one will probably be around gearing, housing, and mounts, so expect a bit more information on that regard. But you'll have to subscribe to not miss out on that at all. As per usual, I'll also be putting my Discord, where I'm hoping to create a community, as well as Twitter and other details in the comments below. So yeah, let's have a chat on social media and let me know once you have any requests for kinds of videos that you would like me to make, and I'll see if I can make a plan. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.